A German shepherd refuses to let a baby sleep alone. Every night he whines at the crib, paces the floor, and scratches at the door. The parents brush it off. Until one night, he lets out a terrifying howl that wakes them in a panic. Something is very, very wrong. And when they finally discover the truth, they immediately call 911. What did the dog sense that they couldn't? And why was he willing to risk everything to protect the baby? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows as Daniel and Grace Reynolds stepped into their home, carrying their precious cargo. Baby Noah slept peacefully in his car seat, tiny fingers curled into fists. The familiar click of claws on hardwood announced Rambo's approach, his tail wagging in excited circles. "Hey boy," Daniel whispered, setting down the diaper bag. "Come meet the newest member of our family." Grace carefully lifted Noah from his car seat and walked toward the nursery, decorated in soft blues and greens. Rambo followed close behind, his usual boundless energy replaced by careful, measured steps. As Grace lowered Noah into his crib, Rambo's tail stopped wagging. He lifted his nose, sniffing the air with unusual intensity. "It's okay, Rambo," Grace said with a gentle laugh. "That's just how babies smell. You'll get used to it." The days that followed settled into a new routine, marked by midnight feedings and diaper changes. But something about Rambo's behavior shifted. The normally playful German shepherd spent hours stationed outside the nursery door, his dark eyes fixed on Noah's crib. When Noah napped, Rambo would lie in the hallway, occasionally letting out soft whines. "Grace, he's fine," Daniel said one evening, rubbing his tired eyes as he looked up from a stack of work papers. "He's just being overprotective. Remember how he used to guard your shoes when we first got him?" Grace watched Rambo pace outside the nursery. "I suppose you're right. It's sweet, really. Like he's appointed himself as Noah's personal bodyguard." That night, after a dinner of takeout Chinese food, Daniel loaded the dishwasher while Grace wiped down the counter. The baby monitor on the kitchen counter transmitted Noah's soft breathing. Rambo hadn't moved from his spot beside the crib, sitting perfectly still with his ears alert and forward. "Come on, boy," Grace called softly, walking into the nursery. "Time for bed." She reached for his collar, but Rambo didn't budge. His eyes remained fixed on Noah's sleeping form, his body tense and alert. "Rambo," she tried again, gently tugging his collar. The shepherd planted his feet more firmly, refusing to move. Daniel appeared in the doorway, drying his hands on a dish towel. "What's wrong?" "He won't come out," Grace said, unable to hold back a small laugh. "I think someone's taking their babysitting duties a bit too seriously." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on, you big goofball. Noah's fine." But Rambo stayed put, his watchful gaze never leaving the crib where Noah slept peacefully, unaware of his four-legged protector's dedication. Morning sunlight streamed through the nursery windows, painting warm patterns on the pale blue walls. Grace blinked awake to the sound of Noah's gentle cooing through the baby monitor. When she entered the nursery, she found Rambo exactly where they'd left him the night before, curled up beside the crib like a faithful sentinel. "Did you stay here all night, sweet boy?" Grace whispered, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. Rambo's tail thumped softly against the carpet, but his eyes remained fixed on Noah. As Grace lifted Noah from his crib, Rambo immediately rose to his feet. He pressed his nose close to Noah's dangling feet, sniffing intently. A low whimper escaped his throat, and he pawed gently at Grace's leg. "What is it, boy?" she asked. But Rambo just continued his careful inspection of Noah, his whimpers growing more insistent. Throughout the day, Rambo's strange behavior intensified. He refused to leave the nursery for his morning walk, something he'd always loved. When Daniel finally managed to coax him outside with treats, Rambo rushed through his business and pulled frantically at the leash to get back inside. "I've never seen him like this," Grace said, watching Rambo pace back and forth in front of the nursery door while she folded laundry. "Maybe he's jealous?" Daniel shook his head. "He doesn't seem angry or upset with Noah. It's almost like he's worried about something." As the week progressed, Rambo's agitation grew more pronounced. His pacing became constant, wearing a visible path in the carpet. At night, they would wake to the sound of his claws scratching at the floor near Noah's crib, his nails leaving marks in the wood. "This has to stop," Daniel muttered one morning, examining the scratched floorboards. "We can't have him destroying the nursery." That evening, after Grace had nursed Noah and placed him in his crib for the night, Daniel found Rambo standing rigid at the nursery doorway. His tail was straight, his ears forward, and every muscle in his body seemed tense. "Come on, buddy, let's go," Daniel said, reaching for Rambo's collar. The shepherd didn't move. Instead, he lowered his head toward the floor and let out a soft growl, not threatening, but urgent and focused entirely on the floorboards beneath his feet. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion and frustration evident on his face. "Not this again." He grabbed Rambo's collar firmly and began leading him away from the nursery, the dog's paws sliding reluctantly across the floor as he continued to growl at whatever had caught his attention below. The night wrapped the house in silence, broken only by the gentle whisper of wind through trees outside. Grace shifted beneath her blankets, drifting between sleep and wakefulness. A soft, scratching sound filtered through the baby monitor, light at first, then more persistent. She tried to ignore it, pulling the covers higher, but then came the sound that always tugged at her heart, Rambo's low, mournful whimper. Daniel stirred beside her. "Not again," he muttered, throwing back the covers. His feet hit the cold hardwood floor as he made his way to the nursery. In the dim hallway light, he found Rambo sprawled by the door, his paws working frantically at the floorboards. "You can't sleep here, Rambo," Daniel said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. He reached down and gently pulled the dog away from the door. Rambo resisted, his nails scraping against the wood as Daniel guided him down the hallway. With a firm command, Daniel ushered Rambo out of the nursery area and closed the door, effectively locking him out. The scratching started again almost immediately. Rambo's whines grew more insistent, a constant stream of worried sounds that echoed through the house. For the next hour, his distressed noises continued, making it impossible for anyone to sleep. When morning finally arrived, Grace noticed something different about Noah during his usual feeding time. The normally energetic baby seemed sluggish, his eyes heavy with sleep even after his normal wake-up time. "He's so drowsy today," Grace said, cradling Noah close as she sat in the rocking chair. She pressed her lips to his forehead, checking for fever. "Do you think he's coming down with something?" "Babies go through phases," Daniel reassured her, though worry flickered across his face. "Remember what Dr. Thompson said about sleep patterns changing?" Meanwhile, Rambo paced the nursery floor, his nose working overtime. He moved in precise patterns, sniffing intensely at specific spots near the crib, his behavior growing more frantic with each pass. His tail remained low, his body tense with obvious concern. As evening approached, Rambo's protective behavior reached new heights. He positioned himself directly under Noah's crib, refusing to move even for dinner. When Daniel tried to coax him out with treats, Rambo merely turned his head away, his eyes fixed on the baby above him. "That's it," Daniel said, his patience finally snapping. He grabbed Rambo's collar and, despite the dog's resistance, dragged him from the nursery to the living room. Rambo fought against him the whole way, his paws scrabbling for purchase on the floor. Once in the living room, Daniel closed and locked the door, leaving Rambo separated from the rest of the house. The moment the lock clicked, Rambo's whimpers began, deep, sorrowful sounds that seemed to come from his very soul. He pressed his nose against the crack under the door, his cries growing more desperate with each passing minute. The sound of Rambo's distress filled the house, his whimpers a heartbreaking melody that spoke of urgent worry. But his warnings went unheeded, his desperate attempts to communicate dismissed as mere misbehavior. The morning sun cast gentle rays through the nursery window, but something felt off to Grace as she approached Noah's crib. Her baby boy, usually stirring and cooing by this hour, lay still. Her heart skipped a beat as she reached down to pick him up. "Noah, sweetie," she whispered. His little body felt unusually limp in her arms for a moment, before he finally moved, his eyes fluttering open slowly. Grace held him close, studying his face. He seemed different, too quiet, too still. She pushed away the worry rising in her chest, telling herself she was being overprotective. "You're just extra sleepy today, aren't you?" Throughout the day, Noah drifted in and out of consciousness, barely staying awake long enough to eat. Grace found herself checking on him constantly, her concern growing with each passing hour. When Daniel finally came home from work, she couldn't hold back anymore. "Something's wrong," she said, meeting him at the door. "He's sleeping too much. I can barely keep him awake for feedings." Daniel set down his briefcase and loosened his tie. "Babies have growth spurts, Grace," he said, rubbing his tired eyes. "You worry too much." But even as he spoke, Rambo paced the nursery floor, his nails clicking against the hardwood. The dog's attention remained fixed on specific spots, particularly around the heater. He lowered his head, emitting a low growl at the floorboards. His behavior had become almost obsessive, sniffing and circling the same areas repeatedly. Grace watched him from the doorway, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "Look at him, Daniel. I think he's trying to tell us something." Daniel leaned against the wall, shaking his head. "He's a dog, Grace. He's just acting weird because of Noah. Dogs get jealous sometimes." The night settled in, dark and heavy. The house grew quiet, except for Rambo's persistent pacing. Then, without warning, a sound unlike anything they'd ever heard from him split the silence. A deep, haunting howl that seemed to shake the very walls. Grace and Daniel bolted upright in bed. Before they could process what was happening, Rambo burst into their bedroom, barking frantically. His tail hung low, and his eyes were wild with panic. "What the hell is wrong with him?" Daniel started to say, but his words were cut short as Grace suddenly swayed beside him. "I don't," she mumbled, her hand gripping the bedpost for support. The room seemed to tilt and spin around her. "Daniel, I don't feel right." Her knees buckled as Rambo's barking grew more urgent, his message finally impossible to ignore. Something was very, very wrong. Grace's fingers tightened around the bedpost as the room spun around her. Her legs felt like jelly, and her thoughts came slow and muddy. Beside her, Daniel blinked hard, trying to clear his clouded vision. His movements were clumsy, as if he'd just woken from a deep sleep. Rambo's urgent barking echoed through the house. The German shepherd darted back and forth between them and the nursery door, his nails clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. Each time he returned, he pushed his cold nose against their legs, whining and nudging them with growing desperation. Something's not right," Grace mumbled, her words slurring slightly. Daniel forced himself to focus, fighting through the heaviness in his limbs. He stumbled toward Noah's room, using the wall for support, As he crossed the threshold, the air felt thick and strange, almost syrupy in his lungs. The night light cast an eerie glow across the crib, where their baby lay motionless. His hands trembled as he reached for Noah, lifting him carefully. The baby didn't stir, his little body limp in Daniel's arms. Cold fear cut through the fog in his mind. "Noah," he whispered, patting his son's cheek gently. "Come on, buddy, wake up." Behind him, Grace took an unsteady step forward and stumbled again, catching herself against the doorframe. Rambo immediately grabbed her sleeve between his teeth, pulling with gentle but insistent tugs. His eyes were wide and pleading, his whole body tense with urgency. "The air," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel, something's wrong with the air." The realization hit them both at once. This wasn't normal drowsiness. This wasn't just anxiety or paranoia. Something was seriously wrong. Grace's hand shook as she pulled her phone from her pocket. She tried to dial 911, but her fingers felt numb and clumsy. The phone slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor as her knees gave out. She sank down, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Daniel swayed where he stood, one hand gripping the doorframe while the other held Noah close to his chest. The room tilted dangerously around him, and black spots danced at the edges of his vision. Rambo's behavior became even more frantic. He pressed his body against their legs, pushing and nudging them toward the front door. When they didn't move quickly enough, he circled around behind them, refusing to let them stay still, herding them forward with desperate determination. Rambo's frantic barking filled the house as he darted between his family members, his claws scraping desperately against the hardwood floor. His powerful body pressed against their legs, herding them toward the front door with determined urgency. The German shepherd's eyes were wide with panic, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by fierce protective instinct. Daniel stumbled forward, his arms trembling as he clutched Noah's limp form to his chest. The world tilted and swayed around him, but somehow he managed to stay upright, focusing all his remaining strength on holding his son safely. Each step felt like wading through deep water, his legs heavy and uncooperative. Grace crawled along the hallway, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The carpet beneath her hands seemed to shift and ripple, but she forced herself forward, following Rambo's insistent nudging. When she finally reached the front door, her fingers fumbled with the handle, slipping off twice before she managed to twist it open. The instant the door cracked open, Rambo shouldered it wide and shoved them all through with surprising strength. Cold night air rushed over them, sharp and clean in their lungs after the heavy atmosphere inside. Grace collapsed onto the front steps, her body racked with deep, painful coughs that seemed to tear through her chest. Daniel staggered a few more steps before his knees gave out and he sank to his knees in the damp grass. Noah lay motionless in his arms, his small face pale in the moonlight. Terror gripped Daniel's heart as he stared down at his son's still form. "Noah," he whispered hoarsely, gently patting the baby's cheek. "Please, buddy." Rambo suddenly sprinted toward the driveway, his powerful barks echoing through the quiet neighborhood. He stood at the edge of the property, barking with fierce intensity as if calling for help. His dark form was silhouetted against the streetlights as he demanded attention from anyone who might hear. As if in answer to his calls, headlights appeared at the end of the street, growing brighter as they approached. The red fire truck pulled up to their house, its lights casting emergency patterns across the front yard. Firefighters jumped out, equipment in hand, rushing toward the family huddled on their lawn. "Something's wrong. Inside." Daniel managed to gasp out, swaying dangerously even on his knees. His vision blurred, and he felt himself starting to tip sideways. One of the medics quickly took Noah from his arms, laying the baby on a waiting stretcher. With practiced efficiency, she pressed an oxygen mask over his tiny face. CO poisoning. Get them oxygen now, she called out to her teammates. Grace fought to keep her eyes open, her head feeling impossibly heavy. Through her blurred vision, she watched Rambo sitting beside her, his chest heaving as he panted from exertion. His intense gaze never left Noah, tracking every movement of the medics as they worked on the baby. In that moment, even through her fog of confusion and fear, Grace realized that their loyal dog had just saved their lives. The ambulance's interior lights cast harsh shadows as Grace held Noah's tiny hand, her thumb gently stroking his palm. The oxygen mask covered most of his small face, making him look even more fragile than usual. Monitors beeped steadily around them, each sound both reassuring and terrifying. Daniel sat beside her, his own oxygen mask fogging with each breath, his fingers intertwined tightly with hers. At the back of the ambulance, Rambo maintained his vigilant watch. The German Shepherd had refused to be left behind, planting himself firmly at the vehicle's open doors. His dark eyes darted between the paramedics and his family, tracking every movement with intense focus. His oxygen levels are improving, one of the paramedics announced, adjusting something on Noah's monitor. Grace let out a shaky breath, tears sliding down her cheeks. The firefighter who had followed them to the ambulance stepped closer, his expression grave. "We've done a complete reading of your house," he said, pulling out a small device. The carbon monoxide levels were extremely high, particularly in the nursery area. He paused, his face softening with concern. "If you hadn't gotten out when you did, you wouldn't have woken up at all." Daniel pulled his oxygen mask down slightly. "How did we not notice?" His voice was hoarse, filled with disbelief and guilt. "That's the thing about carbon monoxide," the firefighter explained. "It's odorless, colorless. You can't detect it without proper equipment. But animals—" He glanced at Rambo, who sat alert despite his obvious exhaustion. "They can sometimes sense things we can't." Grace and Daniel exchanged stunned looks as the reality of what had happened sank in. Their gazes drifted to Rambo, who remained steadfast in his position, his tail still, eyes fixed on his family. All those days of strange behavior, the scratching, the whining, the refusing to leave the nursery, it hadn't been overprotectiveness or jealousy. It had been warning after warning that they'd dismissed. Daniel reached up with trembling fingers to wipe his eyes. "He knew," he whispered, his voice cracking. "He tried to tell us all along." Grace extended her free hand toward Rambo, who immediately moved closer. Her fingers sank into his thick fur as tears continued to fall. "He didn't just warn us," she said, her throat tight with emotion. "He saved us." Rambo let out a soft whimper and rested his head against her lap. His body finally relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained fixed on Noah. The exhaustion of his desperate rescue effort showed in his drooping ears and heavy breaths, but there was relief in his posture as he watched his family breathe safely under the care of the paramedics. The fire truck's red lights painted the neighborhood in an eerie glow as firefighters moved in and out of the Reynolds home. Grace and Daniel sat in the back of the ambulance, their shoulders touching, watching as the medic gently checked Noah's vital signs. The baby's color had improved, and his breathing was steadier now, though he remained unusually quiet. "His oxygen levels are much better," the medic said with an encouraging smile. "We still want to get him to the hospital for observation, but he's responding well to treatment." Grace squeezed Daniel's hand, relief washing over her tired face. Rambo lay at their feet, his ears perking up at every movement Noah made. Inside the house, firefighters conducted their investigation, their flashlights sweeping across walls and floors. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, a firefighter with graying hair and concerned eyes approached the ambulance. "Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds," he began, his expression grim. "We've found the source of the leak." He pulled off his helmet, holding it against his chest. "Your heating unit. It wasn't just faulty. Someone did a terrible job on it. This wasn't just an accident." Daniel straightened up, confusion crossing his face. "What do you mean?" "The workmanship was absolutely negligent," the firefighter explained. "Whoever worked on it left it a death trap. If your dog hadn't acted the way he did, you and your son wouldn't have stood a chance." Daniel's face paled as recognition dawned. "We had it repaired," he said slowly. "Just a few weeks ago. A local contractor." His voice trailed off as the implications sank in. Grace wrapped her arms around herself, a shiver running through her body that had nothing to do with the night air. The thought that someone's negligence had nearly killed their baby made her stomach turn. She looked down at their home, no longer seeing the warm, safe haven they'd created, but a place that had almost become their tomb. Daniel's jaw clenched, his expression hardening as anger replaced shock. "I need to find out who did this," he said, his voice low but determined. His hands balled into fists at his sides. As the ambulance prepared to transport them to the hospital for further observation, Rambo carefully positioned himself at Noah's feet. His protective stance hadn't changed, his dark eyes fixed firmly on the baby's face. Even now, after the immediate danger had passed, he remained vigilant, ready to sound the alarm at the first sign of trouble. The fluorescent lights of the hospital emergency room buzzed overhead as medical staff whisked the Reynolds family through the sliding doors. Everything moved in a blur of white coats and urgent voices. A team of nurses immediately took Noah, his tiny form dwarfed by the hospital bed, while others guided Daniel and Grace to nearby treatment rooms. "We need to start oxygen therapy right away," a doctor explained as they wheeled Noah down the corridor. Grace tried to follow, but her legs wobbled beneath her. "Ma'am, we need to get you treated too," a nurse said gently, helping her onto a bed. Through the glass entrance doors, Grace could see Rambo's dark form settling onto the concrete, his eyes fixed on the building. Hospital policy wouldn't allow him inside, but that didn't stop him from maintaining his vigil. As nurses inserted IV lines into their arms, Grace's hands trembled. The memory of those terrifying moments kept replaying in her mind, the heaviness in her limbs, the way Noah had felt so limp in her arms, the dizziness that had nearly pulled her under. Her chest tightened with each breath, even though the oxygen mask was helping clear her system. "Your son is responding well to treatment," a kind-faced nurse assured her, adjusting the IV drip. "His oxygen levels are improving steadily." Grace nodded, but the knot in her stomach wouldn't ease. She turned her head toward the entrance, watching as a hospital worker in blue scrubs crouched down to pet Rambo. The German shepherd accepted the attention while maintaining his watchful position, his loyalty unwavering even now. In the bed next to her, Daniel was already pulling out his phone, his movements slow but purposeful. His face was pale beneath the oxygen mask, but his eyes burned with determination as he scrolled through his recent calls and emails. "I hired him through Service Connect," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Keith something. He said he was licensed." His fingers shook as he tapped through his phone's history. Here it is: Keith Morton, Heating and Cooling. Grace watched as Daniel's jaw clenched, the muscles working beneath his skin. He stared at the contractor's information on his screen, and she could see the anger building in his expression. Someone's carelessness, or worse, had nearly cost them everything. "We'll find out exactly what happened," he said, his voice low but firm. If this wasn't an accident... He trailed off, his grip tightening on the phone as he continued searching through his records. Through the glass doors, Rambo remained at his post, a silent guardian waiting for his family to return. The harsh hospital lighting had given way to early morning sun streaming through the windows, but Daniel hadn't slept. His fingers moved methodically across his phone screen, piecing together information about the contractor who had worked on their heating system. Grace sat beside him, gently rocking Noah in her arms while monitoring his oxygen levels. "Got him," Daniel said, his voice rough from exhaustion. "Keith Rowland. Remember Mrs. Peterson next door recommended him? Said he did quick work at a good price." Grace nodded slowly, memories surfacing. "The job only took a few hours. I remember thinking it was fast, but he seemed so confident about it." Daniel's frown deepened as he scrolled through search results. Review after review painted a disturbing picture. "Look at this," he said, turning the screen toward Grace. 3 complaints about faulty wiring in the past year. A family in Oak Ridge had their basement flood because of his shoddy pipework. His breath caught as he found another post. "Grace, there was another gas leak. A couple across town just last summer." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "But there's nothing about legal action, no consequences. He just keeps working, keeps putting people at risk." Grace's arms tightened protectively around Noah. "How is that possible? How can he get away with it?" "Small jobs, different neighborhoods," Daniel muttered, scrolling further. "He probably counts on people not wanting the hassle of a lawsuit. Or maybe he threatens them somehow." With trembling fingers, Daniel pulled up the fire department's number. Chief Evans answered on the 3rd ring. "Mr. Reynolds," the chief's voice was alert despite the early hour. "How's your family doing?" "We're stable," Daniel replied, then launched into what he'd discovered. He detailed the pattern of complaints, the previous gas leak, the consistent negligence in Keith's work. The chief's response was immediate and grave. "Send me everything you've found. If this guy is as careless as you're saying, he's a danger to more than just your family." After sharing the information, Daniel ended the call. His hand clenched around the phone, knuckles white with tension. The weight of what could have happened, what might still happen to other families, pressed heavily on his shoulders. Grace watched him, her eyes filled with concern. "What are we going to do?" Daniel looked at Noah, peaceful in his sleep despite the monitoring wires still attached to him. His son's chest rose and fell steadily now, each breath a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. "We're going to make sure he never does this to anyone else." Outside the hospital room window, Rambo sat alert at his post, his ears suddenly perking up as if sensing the shift in his family's resolve. The morning sun warmed the hospital parking lot as Daniel and Grace prepared to leave with Noah. After 3 days of constant monitoring, they were finally cleared to go home. Grace held Noah's carrier close, still protective after their near tragedy. As they stepped through the automatic doors, a familiar bark echoed across the lot. Rambo, who had barely left his post outside the hospital, bounded toward them with his tail wagging frantically. He'd been fed and cared for by kind hospital staff, but his eyes had never left the entrance, waiting for his family. "Hey, boy," Grace said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Rambo whined excitedly, stretching up to sniff Noah's carrier. His nose twitched as he carefully inspected every inch, making sure his smallest pack member was truly okay. Noah gurgled happily at the sight of his furry guardian, reaching out with tiny fingers. Daniel was just loading their overnight bag into the car when footsteps approached from across the parking lot. A man in an expensive suit walked toward them, his polished leather shoes clicking against the asphalt. His smile was practiced and smooth, but something predatory lurked behind it. "Daniel Reynolds?" the man asked, maintaining his artificial grin. Daniel turned slowly, tension creeping into his shoulders as he nodded. "I heard you were making accusations about my work." The words came out casual, but carried an unmistakable edge. Grace's hands tightened on Noah's carrier. She knew that voice, remembered it from their house just weeks ago. Keith Rowland, the contractor who had turned their home into a death trap. Daniel drew himself up to his full height, jaw set. "If by accusations you mean I'm reporting you for nearly killing my family, then yeah." Keith's smile tightened, becoming more of a sneer. "Careful what you say, Reynolds. I wouldn't want this to get messy." Before Daniel could respond, a low growl rumbled through the parking lot. Rambo stepped forward, placing himself between Keith and the family. His ears were pinned flat against his head, teeth bared in warning. Gone was the gentle family pet. In his place stood a fierce protector, ready to defend his loved ones. Keith's confident facade cracked. His eyes widened slightly as he took in the sight of the German Shepherd, whose hackles were now raised menacingly. He took a quick step backward. "I'll see myself out," Keith muttered, trying to maintain some dignity as he retreated. They watched him disappear around the corner of the building. Daniel let out a long breath, his fists slowly unclenching. "Yeah, we need to do something about him." The Reynolds family stepped into their home cautiously, as if entering a place they didn't quite recognize anymore. The familiar scent of lavender air freshener remained, but an unsettling awareness of what had nearly happened hung in the air like an invisible fog. Rambo padded through the front door first, his nails clicking against the hardwood floors. His ears perked forward as he began a methodical inspection of every room. He sniffed corners, checked windows, and paused near the heating vents, making sure no trace of danger remained. Grace held Noah close to her chest as she watched their loyal guardian make his rounds. "He's still protecting us," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Only after completing his thorough inspection did Rambo return to his post beside Noah's crib, settling down with a soft huff. His eyes remained alert, scanning the room periodically. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open and phone in hand. The list of reviews about Keith Rowland's work stretched across his screen like a roadmap of negligence. With determined fingers, he dialed the first number. "Hello, Mrs. Martinez. This is Daniel Reynolds. I saw your review about Keith Rowland's work on your house." One call led to another, and each story made Daniel's stomach twist tighter. A young mother in tears described how her children had nearly been electrocuted by faulty wiring. An elderly couple detailed the extensive water damage that had forced them from their home for months. "My kids could have died," one woman sobbed through the phone, her voice breaking. "But I didn't know what to do. He just laughed it off, said I was being dramatic." Daniel's knuckles turned white as he gripped the phone. "I do," he said firmly. "I know exactly what we need to do." He spread the documents across the kitchen table. Printed reviews, photos from other victims, and the preliminary report from the fire department. The paper trail of Keith's negligence formed a damning picture. Daniel picked up his phone one more time, but this time he wasn't calling the fire chief. "Hello? I need to speak with a lawyer," he said, his voice steady with purpose. "It's about a contractor whose negligence nearly killed my family." Rambo lifted his head from his paws, watching Daniel intently from his position near Noah's room. He settled back down, but his eyes remained fixed on his human, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. The battle for justice was just beginning, and Rambo would be there every step of the way, doing what he did best, protecting his family. Daniel sat in attorney Melissa Carter's office, the leather chair creaking softly as he leaned forward. The manila folder in his hands felt heavy with the weight of countless lives affected by Keith Rowland's careless work. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the scattered papers across the polished desk. "Look at this," Daniel said, pulling out a stack of invoices. "He charged full price for substandard work. And here?" He spread out several inspection reports. "The fire marshal found 3 separate code violations in our heating system alone." Melissa adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, her sharp eyes scanning each document with practiced precision. She picked up a handwritten statement, her frown deepening as she read. "These testimonies from other homeowners are disturbing. Gas leaks, electrical hazards, structural issues." Daniel watched as she methodically organized the evidence into neat piles. The office was quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the shuffling of papers. Each document told a story of negligence, of families put at risk. "This isn't just negligence, Daniel," Melissa said finally, looking up from the papers. Her voice carried a weight of seriousness that made Daniel sit straighter. "This is criminal endangerment. If we can prove that he knowingly cut corners, he could be looking at serious charges." Daniel's fist clenched involuntarily, his knuckles turning white. "He nearly killed my son." The words came out raw, filled with barely contained anger. Melissa nodded, her expression softening slightly, but maintaining its professional edge. "And we're going to make sure he never does this again." She pulled out a legal pad and began writing rapidly, her pen scratching against the paper. "I'll draft the complaint today. We can file the case within the week." As she worked, Daniel watched her transform their collection of evidence into the beginnings of a legal document. Her efficiency gave him hope. Finally, someone was taking action. Leaving the office, Daniel pulled out his phone and dialed Grace's number. The connection crackled as she picked up. "How did it go?" Grace asked, her voice anxious but hopeful. "Better than we expected," Daniel replied, walking toward his car. "The lawyer thinks we have a strong case. She's filing—" He was cut off by the sound of Rambo's deep growl in the background. The dog's usually gentle demeanor had shifted to something more threatening. "Grace? What's wrong?" "Hold on," she whispered. There was rustling on the other end as she moved. There's a car outside, just sitting there." Daniel's heart rate quickened. "What kind of car?" "Dark sedan, tinted windows." Grace's voice was barely audible now. "Someone's watching the house, Daniel." The evening cast long shadows through the windows as Grace methodically checked each lock in their home. Her fingers trembled slightly as she secured the last window, the metal latch clicking firmly into place. The events of the day had left them all on edge, especially after the mysterious car outside their house. Rambo took up his position by the front door, his muscular form perfectly still except for his constantly moving ears. His dark eyes remained fixed on the entrance, alert and watchful. Daniel watched the German shepherd's rigid posture and felt his own anxiety rising. He'd never seen Rambo so focused, so intent. "He's been like this for hours," Grace whispered, cradling Noah against her chest. The baby had finally fallen asleep, unaware of the tension filling their home. The clock ticked past midnight, its soft sounds barely audible over the gentle hum of the heating system, the new one they'd had installed after the incident. Suddenly, bright lights swept across their living room walls as a car pulled up outside. Daniel's heart jumped into his throat as he carefully approached the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek out. The same dark sedan from earlier sat idling in front of their house, its tinted windows revealing nothing of who might be inside. Daniel's mouth went dry. A sharp knock cut through the silence, making Grace jump. Noah stirred but didn't wake. Daniel moved toward the door, his steps measured and careful. Rambo remained still but alert, his eyes never leaving the door. "Who is it?" Daniel called out, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "You're making a mistake, Reynolds." Keith's voice came through clear and threatening, sending a chill down Daniel's spine. The contractor's tone carried an unmistakable warning that made Daniel's jaw clench tight. Before Daniel could reach for the door handle, Rambo exploded into action. The German shepherd's deep, menacing growl filled the room, followed by fierce barking as he lunged at the door. The wood rattled in its frame from the force of his charge. "Jesus Christ!" Keith cursed from the other side, his footsteps stumbling backward. Daniel pressed his eye to the peephole just in time to see Keith's face, twisted with anger and fear, illuminated by the porch light. The contractor shot one last glare at the house before hurrying back to his car. The engine roared to life, and the sedan peeled away into the darkness, leaving only the echo of squealing tires. Daniel's shoulders sagged with relief as he knelt beside Rambo, who was still standing guard, but had stopped barking. He ran his hand through the dog's thick fur, feeling the tension in the animal's muscles. "I get it now, boy," Daniel murmured, scratching behind Rambo's ears. The dog panted softly, but kept his vigilant watch on the door, his protective instincts still fully engaged. The morning sun had barely risen when Grace jolted awake to the wailing of police sirens. Her heart hammered in her chest as she rushed to the window, fear gripping her throat. The sound was too close, too urgent, echoing through the quiet suburban streets like a warning bell. She hurried outside, her bare feet cold against the concrete steps, the morning dew dampening her skin. What she saw made her stop short. 3 police cars were parked in front of Keith Rowland's house just down the street, their lights painting the neighborhood in flashing red and blue, creating an eerie dance of shadows across the familiar houses. Officers were leading Keith out in handcuffs, the metal glinting in the early morning light. Even from a distance, she could see the rage contorting his face, his features twisted into an ugly mask of defiance. Daniel stood nearby, talking with another officer, his posture straight and determined, looking more confident than she'd seen him in weeks. The previous night, after Keith's threatening visit, Daniel had made several calls. He'd contacted not only the fire department, but the district attorney's office as well. The evidence they'd gathered from other victims, the testimonies, the documentation of faulty repairs, the photos of dangerous installations, had painted a clear picture of Keith's negligence. Attorney Carter had worked through the night, organizing everything into an airtight case. But what sealed Keith's fate was the discovery that he'd been operating without a valid contractor's license for over 2 years. Each job he'd performed, including the one that had nearly killed the Reynolds family, was illegal. The revelation had sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, with more victims coming forward by the hour. As the officers read Keith his rights, his eyes locked onto Daniel. "This isn't over," he snarled, struggling against the officer's grip, his face red with fury. Daniel didn't flinch. He stood his ground, meeting Keith's glare with unwavering determination, his shoulders squared. "Yeah, it is." The officers pushed Keith's head down and guided him into the back of a police cruiser. The door slammed shut with a satisfying thunk, and for the first time since the carbon monoxide incident, Daniel felt like his family was truly safe. A weight he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying lifted from his shoulders. When Daniel walked through his front door minutes later, Rambo bounded toward him, tail wagging with excitement, his paws clicking against the hardwood floor. The German shepherd's entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the tense, vigilant guardian of the past few days. In his place was their loving, playful companion once again, as if he too understood that the threat had finally passed. Daniel knelt down, wrapping his arms around Rambo's neck. The dog's fur was soft and warm against his face, carrying that familiar, comforting scent of home. "You were right about everything, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Rambo responded by nuzzling closer, his tail still wagging happily, offering the unconditional love that had saved their lives. Days passed like gentle waves, each one washing away a little more of the fear that had gripped the Reynolds family. The house transformed slowly but surely. Workers installed a state-of-the-art heating system, their tools creating a symphony of progress that echoed through the halls. The new security system blinked reassuringly, its green lights a constant reminder that they were safe now. Daniel had overseen every repair personally, checking and double-checking each installation with a watchful eye that came from hard-learned experience. The workers didn't mind his attention to detail. In fact, they seemed to respect it, explaining each step of their process with patience and care. Grace found herself breathing easier as the familiar rhythm of daily life returned. The morning sunlight no longer carried shadows of what could have been, instead bringing warmth and promise through the freshly cleaned windows. Even Rambo's posture had softened, though he still maintained his protective watch over the family, especially Noah. As the days turned into weeks, Noah's natural vibrancy returned in full force. His cheeks grew rosy again, and his laughs filled the house like music. One sunny afternoon, he lay on his favorite playmat in the living room, surrounded by colorful toys. Rambo lounged nearby, his tail thumping contentedly against the carpet as he watched his smallest family member. Noah rolled onto his stomach, pushing himself up with determined little arms. His eyes fixed on Rambo, and he reached out with chubby fingers toward the dog's floppy ear. When he finally grabbed it, his delighted giggle bubbled up like a spring of joy. Then, something magical happened. Noah's mouth worked carefully, his face scrunching in concentration. "Rah!" he started, making both Grace and Daniel freeze where they stood. "Rambo!" Grace's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. The first word, not Mom or Dada, but the name of their protector. Daniel chuckled warmly, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "He knows who his hero is," he said softly, wrapping an arm around Grace's shoulders. Rambo's tail wagged faster, and he gently nuzzled Noah's cheek, earning another burst of giggles and a repeated "Rambo" that made everyone's hearts swell. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Grace carried a sleepy Noah up to his nursery. The room felt different now, not a place of fear, but one of safety and love. She hummed softly as she laid Noah in his crib, tucking his favorite blanket around him. Rambo padded in quietly, as he did every night, but this time Grace didn't shoo him away. Instead, she turned to the large, plush dog bed they'd placed beside the crib. She patted it gently, and Rambo's eyes lit up with understanding. He circled once before settling down, his body curling comfortably into the soft material, his eyes fixed lovingly on Noah. Daniel appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a soft smile. "Looks like his new spot," he observed, watching as Rambo let out a contented sigh. Grace looked at her husband, her heart full. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but inside their home, there was nothing but warmth and the gentle, steady breathing of a family finally at peace. A gentle autumn breeze rustled the curtains as Daniel and Grace sat in their living room, watching Noah play with his blocks on the plush carpet. Rambo lay beside the baby, his watchful eyes never straying far from his tiny charge. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patches across the floor where Noah crawled, occasionally steadying himself against Rambo's sturdy frame. The house felt different now. The shadows that had once lurked in every corner had retreated, replaced by a sense of security that wrapped around them like a comfortable blanket. New carbon monoxide detectors blinked steadily on the walls, their quiet presence a reminder of both what they'd survived and how far they'd come. Grace curled her fingers around her steaming mug of chamomile tea, her eyes distant. "I can't believe how close we were to losing everything," she said softly, her voice catching slightly on the words. Daniel shifted in his seat, his gaze fixed on Rambo, who had his head rested on his paws, while Noah played beside him. "And how we almost ignored the one who tried to save us." He reached down and ruffled Rambo's fur affectionately. "I'll never make that mistake again." The German shepherd's tail thumped against the floor at Daniel's touch, but his attention remained focused on Noah, who was now attempting to stack blocks higher than his previous record. A sharp knock at the door startled them both. Rambo's ears perked up, but he remained calm, a far cry from his agitated state during those dangerous days. Daniel stood to answer it, finding Melissa Carter, their attorney, standing on the porch with a portfolio tucked under her arm. "I have some news about the case," she said, stepping inside when Daniel gestured for her to enter. Grace straightened in her seat as Melissa settled into an armchair, her professional demeanor softened by a hint of satisfaction in her eyes. "Keith has been officially charged with fraud and reckless endangerment," Melissa announced, opening her portfolio. "And that's not all. Multiple homeowners have come forward. We're filing a class action lawsuit against him." The weight of worry that had been sitting on Grace's shoulders seemed to lift slightly. She exhaled slowly, relief evident in every line of her face. "He won't be getting away with this," Melissa assured them, her voice firm with conviction. Daniel nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Melissa, for everything." After showing them the relevant documents and explaining the next steps in the legal process, Melissa gathered her things and headed for the door. As it closed behind her, Daniel looked down at Rambo, who had raised his head to watch the proceedings while still maintaining his protective position near Noah. "You gave us a second chance, boy," Daniel said softly. Rambo responded by licking his hand, his brown eyes seeming to hold all the understanding in the world. The community center buzzed with concerned voices as residents filled the rows of folding chairs. Daniel and Grace sat near the front, with Rambo lying calmly at their feet. Noah dozed peacefully in his carrier, occasionally stirring when the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Fire Chief Martinez stood at the podium, his expression serious as he addressed the gathered neighbors. "What happened to the Reynolds family could have happened to any of us," he said, gesturing to a presentation board filled with safety information. "That's why we're offering free home inspections to everyone in the community." Several firefighters and safety inspectors stood along the walls, clipboards in hand, ready to schedule appointments. People lined up eagerly, sharing worried whispers about their own homes. As Grace watched the crowd, an elderly woman with silver hair approached them. Her kind face crinkled with warmth as she smiled at Rambo. "I'm Mrs. Carter," she said, extending a weathered hand. "I heard about what your dog did." She knelt carefully to Rambo's level, her eyes twinkling. "I've always believed animals know more than we do." Rambo's tail wagged gently as he accepted her gentle pat. Grace smiled, touched by the woman's understanding. Throughout the evening, more people approached them. A man in his 40s, with worry lines etched deep in his face, reached for Daniel's hand. "I'm Tom Bradford," he said, his grip firm. "I almost lost my daughter to carbon monoxide last year. I never knew it was because of him." His voice trembled slightly. "If you hadn't exposed Keith, we might never have known the truth." The meeting transformed into something more than just a safety awareness session. Neighbors exchanged phone numbers, created support groups, and organized a system to share information about trustworthy contractors. The sense of community grew stronger with each conversation, each shared story, each determined promise to look out for one another. When they finally returned home that evening, Daniel and Grace felt lighter than they had in weeks. The new heater hummed quietly, properly installed and thoroughly inspected. Carbon monoxide detectors blinked reassuringly from their mounted positions. In the living room, Noah sat on his playmat, reaching for his favorite stuffed animal, while Rambo lay beside him, alert but relaxed. The sight of their son, healthy and safe, playing under their faithful dog's protection, filled them both with profound gratitude. Grace leaned against Daniel's shoulder, watching their little family. Everything was finally safe. A few days after the community meeting, firefighter Mike Thompson knocked on the Reynolds door, his broad smile visible even before Daniel opened it. Rambo trotted up beside Daniel, tail wagging as he recognized the familiar uniform. "Got some news for you, folks," Mike said, stepping inside. Grace joined them in the living room, carrying Noah, who was fascinated by the firefighter's bright yellow suspenders. "The department's been talking," Mike continued, "and we want to honor Rambo for what he did. Not just for your family, but for helping us expose a situation that could have hurt many others." Grace let out a surprised laugh. "A dog getting an award?" Mike's smile widened. "More than an award. He's going to be an honorary K9 hero. We're giving him a service medal." He reached down to pat Rambo's head. "It's not every day we meet a dog who can detect danger before our equipment does." The ceremony took place the following weekend at the fire station. Red and white balloons decorated the entrance, and rows of chairs filled the apparatus bay where the fire trucks usually parked. Rambo sat perfectly still beside Daniel, wearing a new collar for the occasion. His ears perked up at every camera flash, but he remained dignified, as if he knew this moment was important. Firefighters in dress uniforms stood in formation. Neighbors filled the seats, many of them holding handmade signs celebrating their local hero. Several families who had been affected by Keith's negligence came to show their support, their faces full of gratitude. Chief Martinez stepped forward with a small velvet box. Inside gleamed a custom-made medal, specially designed for their four-legged hero. The silver disc caught the light as he approached Rambo. "For extraordinary service to the community," the chief announced, "and for protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, we present this Medal of Honor to Rambo." As the firefighter fastened the medal to Rambo's collar, thunderous applause filled the station. Noah, secure in Grace's arms, reached out toward the shiny emblem hanging from his protector's neck. "Rambo!" he babbled excitedly, causing the crowd to burst into affectionate laughter. The sound of clapping echoed through the station, mixing with happy chatter and the occasional bark from Rambo, who seemed to be soaking in all the attention. For the first time in a long time, everything felt exactly as it should be. That evening, the Reynolds family settled into their familiar routine, though everything felt different now. The kitchen was warm and cozy as Daniel and Grace sat down for a quiet dinner. The events of the day still fresh in their minds. Rambo's new medal caught the light as he lay nearby, its silver surface gleaming against his dark fur. "I keep thinking about how close we came," Grace said softly, pushing her pasta around the plate, "and how many nights I dismissed his warnings as just overprotective behavior." Daniel reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "We all did. But that's behind us now." He glanced at Rambo, who had lifted his head at the sound of their voices. "Though I have to admit, seeing him get that medal today, it felt right." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, the weight of the past few weeks finally lifting from their shoulders. The fear that had gripped them, the sleepless nights wondering if Keith would return, the constant worry about Noah's health. It all seemed like a distant nightmare now. Later that evening, they stood in the nursery doorway, watching Noah drift off to sleep. As always, Rambo had taken his position beside the crib, curled up on his bed, but alert, one ear slightly raised as if listening for any sign of trouble. Daniel couldn't help but chuckle at the sight. I think he's never leaving that spot." Grace smiled warmly, kneeling down to run her fingers through Rambo's thick fur. The dog leaned into her touch, his tail thumping softly against the floor. "Good. I wouldn't want him anywhere else." Noah stirred slightly in his crib, making a soft cooing sound. Rambo's ears twitched, and he lifted his head to check on the baby before settling back down, satisfied that all was well. As the night deepened around them, the house remained peaceful and quiet. The new heating system hummed softly, working perfectly. Outside, crickets chirped their evening song. The family drifted off to sleep, one by one, knowing they would wake up to another day, all thanks to the dog who never gave up on them. 1 month after Keith's arrest, the Reynolds household had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The crisp autumn air carried away the last traces of their ordeal, replacing fear with newfound peace. Noah, now 7 months old, was thriving, his cheeks rosy and his giggles filling the house with joy. Rambo had become something of a local celebrity. During their evening walks through the neighborhood, people would stop to greet him, often pointing out his shiny service medal to their children. Some would even cross the street just to tell him what a good boy he was. He accepted the attention with dignified patience, though his eyes always remained focused on Noah and his stroller. "There goes our hero," Mrs. Carter would call from her porch whenever they passed. Noah would bounce in his stroller, reaching out toward Rambo and babbling his name, which had become his favorite word. Daniel found himself deeply involved with the local fire department's community outreach program. His experience had sparked a passion for preventing similar incidents from happening to other families. He spent his weekends helping organize workshops on home safety, sharing their story with anyone who would listen. At the town hall meeting, Daniel stood at the podium, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "We were lucky," he said, gesturing to his family in the front row. "We had Rambo, but not everyone has a guardian angel with 4 legs and a keen nose. That's why we need to be vigilant, to know the signs, to understand the risks." Grace watched from her seat, holding Noah close as Daniel spoke. She felt proud seeing him turn their near tragedy into something positive, something that could help others. Rambo sat beside them, his posture straight and alert, as if he knew they were talking about him. Back at home, Rambo maintained his nightly vigil by Noah's crib. The dog bed that Grace had placed there had become his permanent spot. Every evening, as soon as Noah was placed in his crib, Rambo would pad over and settle in, his eyes scanning the room one last time before resting his head on his paws. The new heating system worked perfectly, its gentle hum a reminder of how far they'd come. The house felt different now, safer, warmer, more secure. The carbon monoxide detectors they'd installed blinked their green lights steadily, offering constant reassurance. That evening, as Grace moved around the kitchen cleaning up after dinner, she paused by the living room entrance. Rambo was sprawled on the plush rug, his nose twitching slightly as he dozed. There was something different about his posture. The usual tension in his shoulders was gone, replaced by complete relaxation. His paws twitched occasionally in his sleep, and his breathing was deep and even. Grace smiled, realizing this was the first time she'd seen him truly let his guard down since everything had happened. No alert ears, no watchful eyes, just a content dog, finally at peace with the knowledge that his family was safe. The morning of Keith Rowland's trial dawned cold and clear. Daniel adjusted his tie in the courthouse parking lot while Grace smoothed down her skirt, both of them trying to calm their nerves. They'd left Noah with Grace's mother, but Rambo had seemed to understand the importance of this day, pressing his nose against their hands before they left, as if giving them strength. Inside the courtroom, the polished wooden benches filled quickly with other families. Daniel recognized many faces from the support group that had formed after Keith's arrest. Mrs. Thompson clutched her husband's hand, her eyes still haunted by memories of the electrical fire that had destroyed their kitchen. The Patels sat rigidly in the front row, their young daughter's asthma having worsened from the mold Keith's faulty plumbing had caused. As Keith was led in, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to his previous well-dressed appearance, he barely glanced at his victims. His face remained impassive, almost bored, as he took his seat beside his defense attorney. The prosecutor, Sarah Martinez, stood tall as she presented the evidence. Her voice rang clear through the courtroom as she held up photographs of the Reynolds' damaged heating unit. "This," she declared, pointing to the corroded connections, "is what happens when profit matters more than people's lives." The fire department's chief investigator testified next, his weathered face serious as he detailed the numerous safety violations found in Keith's work. "In my 20 years of service," he stated, "I've rarely seen such blatant disregard for human life." When Daniel took the stand, Grace could see him fighting to maintain his composure. His hands gripped the wooden railing as he recounted that terrifying night. "Our dog knew," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "For weeks Rambo tried to warn us, but we didn't understand until it was almost too late. I carried my son out of that house, and he was so still." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Because of Keith Rowland's carelessness, my 6-month-old son nearly died. We all nearly died." Throughout the testimony, Keith remained stone-faced, occasionally whispering to his lawyer, but showing no sign of remorse. When other victims shared similar stories of near disasters, he simply stared ahead, as if their pain meant nothing to him. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, listened intently to each testimony. Her expression grew increasingly stern as the evidence mounted. Falsified certifications, ignored safety codes, and a pattern of threatening customers who complained. After 3 days of testimony, the jury reached their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the forewoman stood. "On the charge of criminal negligence, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant guilty." Keith's facade finally cracked, his face paling as the judge delivered his sentence. 5 years in prison, restitution to all victims, and a lifetime ban from working in home repair services. As they left the courthouse, Daniel and Grace paused on the steps, breathing in the crisp autumn air. Grace squeezed Daniel's hand, feeling the weight of the past months finally lifting from their shoulders. Justice had been served, and their family was safe. The autumn evening filled the Reynolds home with warmth and laughter as guests filtered through the front door. Grace had spent the afternoon preparing finger foods and setting out drinks, while Daniel arranged extra chairs in their living room. Rambo sat alertly by the door, greeting each visitor with a gentle wag of his tail. Firefighter Mike Thompson, who had been first on the scene that fateful night, arrived with his wife Sarah. He immediately knelt to greet Rambo, who remembered him and offered an enthusiastic lick. "There's our hero," Mike said, scratching behind Rambo's ears. Mrs. Carter from next door brought her famous apple pie, and several other neighbors arrived carrying dishes and warm smiles. The house buzzed with conversation and the clinking of glasses. The atmosphere felt different now, lighter, happier, filled with the joy of people who understood just how precious life could be. In the corner of the living room, Noah played on his activity mat, occasionally pulling himself up to crawl a few feet before plopping back down. His cheeks were rosy with health, his giggles infectious as he watched the gathering around him. Fire Chief Roberts shared stories about other remarkable rescues he'd witnessed over the years, but kept coming back to Rambo's persistence. "It's not just that he sensed the danger," the chief explained. "It's that he never gave up trying to warn you. That's something special." As the evening progressed, one of the younger firefighters, Jake Miller, knelt beside Rambo and gave him a thorough ear scratching, "You know, you're one hell of a dog," he said with admiration. The German shepherd's tail thumped against the floor in appreciation. At that moment, Noah crawled determinedly across the room toward Rambo. Everyone watched, smiling, as the baby made his way to his furry protector. When he reached Rambo, Noah threw his tiny arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in the soft fur and letting out a delighted giggle. The room erupted in laughter and applause at the heartwarming display. Daniel stood then, raising his glass as conversation quieted. His eyes were bright with emotion as he looked around at the gathered faces, friends, neighbors, and the first responders who had helped save his family. But most of all, his gaze settled on Rambo, who sat contentedly with Noah still clinging to his neck. To the firefighters, to our friends, and most of all, to Rambo, the hero we never deserved, but the one who saved us all. Rambo's tail wagged happily as the room raised their glasses in his honor, completely unaware that he had just received the greatest tribute of all, the pure, unconditional love of his family. The house settled into a peaceful quiet as the last guests said their goodbyes. Empty plates and glasses had been cleared away, leaving only the gentle hum of the dishwasher as a background noise. The evening's warmth lingered in the air, carrying with it the remnants of laughter and celebration. Daniel carried Noah up the stairs, the baby's head heavy with sleep against his shoulder. Grace followed close behind, her heart full. She watched her husband gently lay their son in his crib. Noah's tiny fingers curled around his favorite blanket as Daniel tucked it around him. Standing in the soft glow of the nursery lamp, Grace felt tears well up in her eyes. The simple act of putting their baby to bed, something they'd done hundreds of times before, now held so much more meaning. Her hand found Daniel's, and they stood together, watching Noah's peaceful breathing. Daniel reached down to stroke Noah's fine hair, marveling at its softness. Each quiet moment like this was a gift they'd nearly lost. The thought made his throat tight with emotion. The familiar click of Rambo's nails on the hardwood announced his arrival. He padded into the nursery and took his position beside the crib, the same spot where he'd first sensed danger weeks ago. But tonight was different. The tension had left his shoulders, and his eyes were heavy with contentment. Daniel knelt beside their faithful guardian, running his hand through the thick fur. "You can rest now, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. "We're safe." Rambo looked up at him with those intelligent eyes, then let out a deep sigh. For the first time in weeks, he didn't scan the room or perk his ears at every small sound. Instead, he laid his head on his paws and let his eyes drift closed, surrendering to the deepest, most peaceful sleep he'd had since that first day they'd brought Noah home. Outside, the moon cast its silver light over the Reynolds home, painting everything in gentle shadows. The night was still, peaceful, no danger lurking in the corners, no threats to guard against. Just a family together, forever grateful to the dog who never stopped protecting them. If you enjoyed the story of Rambo, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.